January 15th, 1919. Commercial Street, Boston. A steel tank groans once, then splits. The sound rolls through the north end, like a train entering the elevated tracks. Then the wall gives way. Molasses does not look dangerous in a barrel or in a cup. It looks slow, heavy, almost harmless. But more than 2 million gallons rushing out of a ruptured tank do not move like a kitchen spill. The first surge comes fast, taller than a person at the front, thick enough to shove wagons, lift debris, and knock adults off their feet before they understand what they are seeing. A brown wave slams into the street and keeps going. Men at the paving yard turn and run. A driver near the firehouse hears a roar, then feels the street hit him. A freight wagon lurches sideways. Windows burst inward. A steel plate from the tank spins through the air like a blade thrown by the tank itself. 1 second, there is an ordinary workday in the waterfront district. The next, there is sugar-colored destruction pushing through the neighborhood. The first scream does not travel far. The molasses swallows sound. It fills space between buildings, crashes into posts, climbs stairways, and wraps around everything it touches. At first it is moving, then it starts to thicken. That is what makes this disaster so cruel. The first impact throws people. The next phase traps them. A rescuer will later say that the streets looked as if the city had been poured into syrup. He is not trying to be poetic. He is trying to describe a place where wood, iron, horses, carts, and adults were all caught in the same brown mass. This is the Boston Molasses Flood. It happens in the North End, a dense working waterfront district of warehouses, narrow streets, rail lines, stables, small shops, and labor yards. The neighborhood is used to industry. It lives beside it. Workers carry freight. Teamsters move loads through Commercial Street. Firefighters keep watch. Dock crews unload cargo from ships coming into Boston Harbor. No one in the district mistakes industrial storage for beauty. But they have learned to treat it as ordinary, and ordinary is often where the worst danger hides. The tank that fails belongs to the Purity Distilling Company, part of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. It stands near the harbor, huge and familiar, roughly 50 feet high and 90 feet across, built to store molasses before it is piped away and turned into alcohol. That alcohol matters in a wartime and post-war economy. Industrial demand has made speed more important than caution. The tank is not an ornament on the skyline. It is part of a system that turns imported sugar into profit. From the beginning, the tank gives warnings, not dramatic warnings. Not an official alarm. The kind of warnings that become background if no one acts on them. It leaks. Residents and workers notice dark streaks running down the sides. Some hear groaning sounds when the tank is full. Molasses drips from seams often enough that people stop treating the drips as a sign of failure and start treating them as a feature of the neighborhood. If a tank leaks on Monday and still stands on Tuesday, many people decide it will stand on Wednesday too. That is the first crack in this story. Not the crack in steel, the crack in judgment. The tank had been built quickly. Evidence after the disaster would point toward thin steel in places where thicker plates were needed. Basic testing had not been done with the seriousness a vessel of that size required. There were claims that it had not been properly filled with water and tested under safe conditions before use. What should have been engineering discipline became confidence without proof. That kind of confidence looks efficient right up until it fails. In the days before the disaster, Boston is cold. Then the weather shifts. A fresh load of molasses arrives by ship and is pumped into the tank. The new load is warmer than what has already been sitting there. Temperature matters in a vessel full of thick liquid. Pressure changes. The contents move differently. The tank is asked to hold another enormous load even though it has already spent years proving it should not be trusted. On the morning of January 15th, the North End is busy but ordinary. Adults move through the streets on errands and work routes. Teamsters guide horses. Men in yards and warehouses handle tools and freight. Firefighters at Engine 31 are on duty near the tank. The harbor keeps its own schedule. No one sees a countdown clock. There is no siren. The tank simply reaches the moment when weakness becomes rupture. When it bursts, the failure is mechanical and immediate. Rivets fly. Steel plates tear loose. The contents surge outward with the force of gravity, pressure, and sheer weight. Later estimates would put the first speed at more than 30 miles per hour. That matters because many people still imagine molasses as a slow substance. Slow is what it becomes after the burst, not what it is in the first violent seconds. In those first seconds, it behaves less like syrup in a jar and more like a collapsing wall. The wave races down Commercial Street and spreads through side spaces, carrying debris with it. It hits buildings hard enough to damage walls and foundations. It tears at the nearby firehouse. It shoves freight cars and knocks structures off balance. The elevated railway nearby shudders under the strike of debris and force. Adults are thrown into posts, pinned against masonry, or dragged under wreckage. Some are hit by the rush itself. Some survive the first impact only to become trapped when the mass cools and stiffens around them. This is the first escalation. The neighborhood is hit by something it has no language for. Not a fire. Not an explosion in the usual sense. Not a flood of water. A flood that moves like a blow and then hardens like glue. The same substance that throws you down also keeps you there. Rescue begins almost at once because the disaster happens in daylight and in a populated district. There is no waiting for the city to discover what happened. The city hears it. Nearby workers run toward the wreckage. Boston police arrive. Firefighters respond where they can. Cadets from the Massachusetts Nautical School training ship anchored nearby race several blocks to the site. Army and Navy personnel come. Red Cross nurses appear. Everyone who reaches the street understands the same thing within seconds. Moving through molasses is like trying to walk through a collapsing wall. A rescuer steps into knee-deep syrup and nearly loses a boot. Another grabs a beam and uses it to pull forward one slow step at a time. Adults caught near doorways are stuck by a combination of liquid, splintered wood, iron fragments, and the cold that is already changing the consistency of the flood. The North End in January is not forgiving. The colder the molasses becomes, the more vicious the rescue becomes. What was fluid enough to surge is now thick enough to hold. This is the human moment at the center of the story. A cadet sees an adult trapped against a doorway frame. The trapped man is not submerged all the way, but the syrup has hardened around his legs and waist, and wreckage has pressed into the opening beside him. The rescuer wades forward until the molasses reaches his chest. Every movement has to be pulled, not stepped. He leans down, gets one arm under the stranger, and tries to lift. Nothing happens. He pulls again. The cold bites through soaked clothing. Other rescuers arrive, and together they pry loose wood, drag the man free inch by inch, and pass him backward through a chain of hands. There is no elegance in it, only strain, breathing, slipping, and the refusal to let one more adult become part of the street. The second escalation is the rescue itself. Every minute the flood grows less like a wave and more like a field of adhesive ruin. The injured cannot simply be reached. They have to be excavated from syrup and debris. Doctors and nurses improvise treatment areas nearby. The wounded are numerous enough that the city has to create makeshift medical spaces. Some adults are pulled out coated so heavily that identification takes time. Others are still missing under collapsed sections of yard, rail, timber, and tank fragments. The search does not end that afternoon. It continues into the night and then into the following days. 4 days pass before rescuers fully stop searching. Some victims are carried into the harbor and found long afterward. The work destroys clothing, tools, and patience. Salt water from fireboats is used to wash streets. Sand is spread to absorb and break up the mess. The harbor itself turns brown. The cleanup reaches far beyond the exact site because boots, wheels, and hands spread the syrup into other streets, homes, vehicles, and public spaces. For weeks, the city is sticky. This is the third escalation. The flood stops moving, but the disaster keeps expanding through cleanup, identification, burial, lost wages, wrecked property, and the stubborn fact that an industrial neighborhood has been wrecked by equipment that was supposed to sit quietly and hold. Then comes the question that every preventable disaster eventually drags into daylight. Why was the tank trusted? At first, there are easy evasions. The company suggests sabotage. There is talk of anarchists, because the era is full of labor, fear, war nerves, and convenient enemies. Blame, when it first appears, looks for a dramatic villain, but the evidence does not hold with sabotage. It moves back toward the tank itself, toward design, testing, materials, oversight, and the decisions made long before the street filled with syrup. 119 claims are brought against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The legal process becomes one of the most important parts of the story because it turns grief into record. Witnesses testify about leaks, noises, and conditions at the site. Engineers study the tank. The hearings go on for years. What emerges is not mystery. It is negligence with paperwork around it. Auditor Hugh Ogden reviews the evidence and reaches the conclusion the company does not want. The tank had not been designed, built, tested, or supervised with the care its size and danger required. The failure is traced to structural weakness and disregard for safety, not to sabotage. The company is held liable and damages are paid. The money does not undo the deaths, but the ruling matters. It helps establish that industrial power cannot simply call catastrophe an accident and walk away. If you build a giant container in a crowded neighborhood, fill it beyond caution, ignore warning signs, and it bursts, the law can follow the chain of responsibility back to you. That is why the legal aftermath matters as much as the wave. The flood destroys a neighborhood in minutes. The case reshapes the meaning of negligence over years. It also changes construction culture. The disaster helps push cities and states toward more formal requirements for review, calculations, permits, and licensed oversight. A tank is no longer just a container if it can flatten a district. It is a structure that carries public risk. And once public risk is admitted, public scrutiny follows. The Boston Molasses flood sounds absurd when reduced to a headline. A wave of molasses sounds like folklore or dark comedy. That is one reason the story survives. But the truth is not absurd at all. It is familiar. A company stores hazardous material in a dense neighborhood. Workers and residents notice warning signs. Management treats them as tolerable. The structure keeps standing, so the danger is recategorized as normal. Then one day, the structure stops standing. What happened in the North End was not strange, because the substance was molasses. What made it deadly was the same logic behind many industrial disasters. Weight, pressure, thin margins, ignored warnings, weak oversight. A crowded place asked to trust private confidence in public space. Even decades later, Boston residents said the smell lingered on hot days. That detail survives Because smell is memory with no gatekeeper. You can avoid a courtroom record. You can avoid a report. You cannot argue with a scent that returns and says this happened here. Today, the site is no longer dominated by the tank. The neighborhood kept going because cities do that, even after catastrophe. Streets were cleaned. Structures were rebuilt. Work resumed. Life does not pause out of respect for the dead, as long as the dead might deserve. But the question remains, and it reaches far beyond Boston. If a tank can leak, groan, and stand in plain sight for years until the day it bursts, what else around us is being treated as safe simply because it has not failed yet?